Thank you very much for the introduction. My name is Serf, and I also coordinate the Netherlands chapter. Excuse me if I have to do some coughing, because I just came from Nepal. Kathmandu pollution is doing something to my lungs, which is one more reason to do this presentation. But I just want to get started, and let's see how it goes. So, just start off. Why is it that poverty still exists when we in fact have more progress and more technological advances today? And why are people dying because of undernourishment when we in fact have enough food to feed the entire world? And why is it that we know the detrimental effects of climate change and biodiversity loss, and yet we still continue to go on with business as usual? And on a more personal note, isn't there something that I can do? I think a lot of people are asking this question themselves, and then they run into climate change, poverty, and also the corruption in politics, and then they either become apathetic to these things because they are such complex issues, or they become apologetic, and they start saying, well, this is just the way it is, and there's nothing we can do about it, it's just human nature. Or they blindly hope that technological process and capitalism in the long run will solve all of these problems. The Zeitgeist movement is an educational movement and wants to create awareness and provide answers to these really complex questions in an attempt to prevent people from becoming either apathetic or apologetic, and actually provide everybody with tools and a train of thought to become active. So it is my hope today that after this Z-Day, you have your own answer to the question, is there something I can do? And that this is, yes, what are we waiting for? So, without further ado, let's address some of these problems and do a little bit of a problem analysis. First of all, 30% of the world's fisheries have been pushed beyond their biological limits. By 2025, 2/3 of the world's population may face water shortages. We're losing 18.7 million acres of forest annually. 82% of the wealth created last year went to the upper 1%. And 59% of the world's population is living on less than $5 a day and are unable to meet their basic needs adequately. And then we still have the corruption in politics, but I think we're just done with all the statistics. So let's continue. Let's have an analysis, and for this we need to have a little bit of a bigger perspective, a structuralist perspective, which basically is, structuralism is a methodology that implies elements of human culture must be understood by way of their relation to a larger overarching system or structure. So let's have a look at what this overarching system and structure is and how it has developed. Just as a disclaimer, because of the shortness of this presentation, this is a oversimplification of this history, of course. But let's move to the biggest mistake humanity has ever made. And this is the agricultural revolution. Anthropology has shown us that for 95% of our own existence, we have spent in a peaceful, egalitarian, hunter-and-gatherer society. And all of this changed once we started to settle down in one place. And there were some mechanisms that came along with that. And these mechanisms is something that we still have today. This is scarcity, that there's not enough to go around for everybody. Property, because I now have my house and my tools. In order to regulate the scarcity and property, we then invented money and trade. And the accumulation of this money and trade leads to competition and inevitably to inequality. And it is these aspects that have influenced time and have continued to up till now. And it's also been justified by economics and philosophers throughout time. For example, we know that we have John Locke on property and Adam Smith with the invisible hand. But But the most important one to focus on, I think, is Thomas Malthus, who simply said, there's not enough to go around for everybody, and therefore he says and justifies that there is scarcity, there is inequality, and people simply have to die off eventually. And with that, there's also the really social Darwinistic tendency of survival of the fittest and justifying this competition. Only the strong will survive. But this interpretation is not from Darwin, but is in fact from Herbert Spencer, who coined the phrase. And it is in fact Charles Darwin who meant something completely different with this. He meant it's better designed for an immediate and local environment. Basically an adaptive quality of human nature and not a competitive one. So both of these things are not right, but they still persist in our society today. And our current situation lets us see that. We have specialized a little bit more, and we have distanced ourselves from the land, and finally we became more and more dependent on money. And we either get money now by being an employee who gets a loan, or we are an employer who gets a profit. And both brings about the labor for income gain that we have today. And after that, we need to spend this money back into the system as consumers, making the whole cycle go. And this consumption cannot stop because GDP needs to increase, because otherwise we have job loss and politicians are being held accountable. Which brings us to infinite growth on a finite planet. It's not only that, there's also a cost efficiency in a really competitive market for the employer that we just talked about. They need to save costs and make money wherever they can in order to survive in this competitive market, otherwise their business will die off. So, where can you save costs? And where can you make money? Well, production costs is one thing. You can save some money and make something with a lesser quality that it breaks down eventually, and then people have to go and buy more stuff. Labor conditions. Let's save on some money that we give to our labor people and actually create really bad conditions because we just need to save money. Examples are the China factories with Nike and Apple. Let's save on environmental safety and the protection of the environment and risk maybe an oil spill, just like Shell has done. Or, well, privacy rights. Who cares? We can just sell the information and we have that, what we would see with Facebook. Preserving resources? No, we need to have all the resources that we can gather to sell some more and deplete rainforests, for example. And going back to the problem that we discussed earlier, providing the needy and hungry who don't have any money to spend, well, that's not profitable to begin with. Which gives us the negative externalities of society today. And these are negative externalities because the market does not see all this. It simply sees making profit, and all these things don't show up in the statistics or in the GDP for economic growth. And eventually, it is these things that is actually a violence upon the people who do this. It's a structural violence. So what does this mean? It means that when taking a structuralist perspective, you see that many problems are symptoms, born out of this outdated socio-economic system, and a system that, regardless of people's good intentions and moral behaviors, pressure them into producing these problems. It also means that when fighting these problems, you are swimming against the current, or climbing up a steep hill, a battle which you will eventually lose. It does not mean that we cannot do anything, and it also does not mean that we should stop fighting the symptoms. It simply means that we eventually also have to make structural changes. And just because this discussion of structural change is complicated, does not mean that we should not have it, because in the end, it is the most productive way to create sustainable change. So this is where we are right now, the current zeitgeist. It stagnates on acknowledging and addressing the root cause of many social problems, and it stagnates on collectively providing possible alternatives and progressive ideas. So, let's move this zeitgeist forward, shall we? Let's establish a train of thought. And it always starts off with human nature. Luckily for us, we have Robert Sapolsky from Stanford University, who has done a lot of research into this. And he explains that behavior is actually caused by seconds before the behavior exists, by brain activity. That's it. But, well, maybe there's a little bit more to it. Maybe minutes before that is based on your sensory input. Hours to days before that based on your hormones. Weeks and months before that due to neuroplasticity. Years before that because of your own adolescent experiences. Decades before that because of epigenetics. Centuries before that because of your genes. And also even millions of years before that because of our evolution. So, yes, two conclusions. The first one, human behavior is complicated. And the second one, every bit of biology can change in different circumstances. So, it's up to us to make the right circumstances. And for that, we need to have a look at public health and how we define public health. Now it's very individualistically explained, and it's only on you. It's the biological and the psychological that combine your health. But as we've just seen with this structuralist perspective, we need to add in the social aspect and the social system as well. And not only that, we need to include the ecological aspect, because we know that even if we don't continue sustainable development on this planet, we will endure the cost in the long run. So we need a biopsychosocial perspective to move this forward, based on our current scientific understanding and not on some particular ideology. And then we can set in motion this train of thought, based on our adaptive human nature, based on our understanding of what is the best public health outcomes. We move away from the competitive market towards something more sustainable, something we could potentially call an NLRB. And what comes next is eventually, when you do this train of thought, you figure out that scarcity is not an option and that we can actually provide for many people. And create an abundance. And provide access instead of property. Instead of money and trade, we can provide this abundance through networked digital feedback. Instead of competition, we work together to create this abundance in open source ecologies and eventually provide an equal opportunity or access for all. This also includes that we need to move a little bit away from labor for income, and that we can do with a little bit more automation. And instead of infinite growth on a finite planet, preserve as many resources as we can. Instead of being economically cost efficient, be technologically cost efficient and have the most optimum design for eventually having positive externalities of our public health. And why can we do this? Well, if there's one thing that has progressed us after the agricultural revolution, it is ephemeralization. Basically, doing more and more with less and less. Technological efficiency. And we've become so good at this that even some products we can produce at zero marginal cost. Meaning that we can make something, but then distribute it without any cost. For example, the Kindle production of books, or the distribution of music through, for example, Spotify. But ephemeralization goes even further, because we can do more with less people. So it makes an impact on employment as well. And in the beginning we were all working on the land, on agriculture, and how many are working there right now? Only 1.5% of the US population, EU statistics are behind that. For manufacturing, it's an ever and steadily declining 12.6%, and both of this is only production. So we provide with most of this. Where are all the other jobs? The service sector, 80% of all the other jobs. But even there, ephemeralization is taking its toll because the most routine jobs in that sector are the easiest ones to automate. And that, therefore, we now see job polarization, moving people back and forth from different jobs. So, there are three arguments. Development in AI and robotics will persist because we want to just make better products. Implementation of AI and robotics will persist as long as this is cost efficient. And the new industries and sectors employ fewer and fewer people. Just as an example, we have Walmart with a value of 221 billion, employing 2.3 million people, and a new company with this zero marginal cost. WhatsApp, 16 billion of value, only employing 55 people when it was sold to Facebook. So, what do? We either invent a whole new sector or many more jobs, or we do something radically different. Well, let's invent some more jobs, some fun jobs. Because that's what we're doing right now. And is it really necessary to have some of these jobs just so that people can make some money, even if they don't contribute that much to society? This is a question that also has been asked because nobody's going to tell you that your job is a bullshit job. But you instead can ask this question for yourself. Well, of course, first of all, it's not the cleaners, the garbage men, the teachers, because if they would quit, we have definitely a problem. But a poll showed that 37% of working British adults say that their job is not making a meaningful contribution to the world. So let's have a look at the audience here. And who considers for themselves that they actually have a bullshit job? That's a couple of people. Now, what I'm wondering is that after this whole event, and after we had a couple of more beers, see if the statistics change and we become a little bit more empathetic. Basically, we just need to do something radically different. And one thing that I particularly like is the idea of a basic income. Many of you might have heard of this, and I just want to go to Canada, where an experiment was done with this basic income, and they basically topped up the income from people that fell under the poverty line and give them free money. It was basically a town with no poverty. And what the main goal was with this experiment was figuring out if people stop working if you give them free money. The result, little to no reductions in the adults working. Yes, there was a little bit of reduction because adolescents went back to school and there was an increase in maternity leave, which I would say are both positive things. But there were some more additional findings. There was a decrease in mental health complaints, there was less hospitalization, less family violence, less drunk driving, and less bar fights. So this experiment was a well-known success. But let's go to the elephant in the room, and, well, how are we ever going to pay for a basic income? I would like to flip this question a little bit around and ask, how much do we pay to not have a basic income? And Evelyn Forget, the researcher from Dolphin Canada, said it best, I think. At the time, Canada was spending $10 billion a year on hospitals, and right now, Canada is spending well over $15 billion a year on hospitals. If hospitalization rates fall by 8.5%, we are talking about $4 billion of potential saving in hospital costs alone. So again, what are we paying? Higher crime rates, higher healthcare costs, lesser education outcomes, and cost of poverty in adults and children. One more statistic, cost of child poverty in the US is $500 billion. And the cost to eradicate poverty with this scheme from Canada is $175 billion. And this is a lot, but it's 1.8 0.08% of the US GDP, and it's 1.4, or it's a quarter of the military budget. So again, this is a political question. And for me, really interesting is a loss of potential. Because how many people already, as we've seen here, are stuck in some jobs while they actually want to contribute to society and do something meaningful. So let's move to a post-work society, as some might call it, and have 4 demands. Full automation of as much work as possible, the reduction of the working week, redistributing the remaining work more equitably, the provisioning of an unconditional and generous income for all citizens, and the diminishment of the work ethic, meaning you don't define yourself by your own job. And from that, we can go from post-work to post-scarcity, because basic income is not the only thing, it's only a transitional step. Just as a summarization, I've wrote it down here. We must do away with the absolute specious notion that everybody has to earn a living. It is a fact today that 1 in 10,000 of us can make a technological breakthrough capable of supporting all the rest. The youth of today are absolutely right in recognizing this nonsense of earning a living. We keep inventing jobs because of this false idea that everybody has to be employed as some kind of drudgery, because according to the Malthusian Darwinistic theory, he must justify his right to exist. So we have inspectors of inspectors and people making instruments for inspectors to inspect inspectors. The true business of people should be to go back to school and think about whatever it was they were thinking about before somebody came along and told them they had to earn a living. Now, I wish that I've said this myself, but it's actually our good friend, our Buckminster Fuller, 50 years ago. Clever guy. If you want to know some more about these things, definitely check out the podcast on the universal basic income. It goes in way more detail than anything that I can explain here. And more on the train of thought for Peter Joseph's human rights movement, the Zeitgeist movement defined. But I think most of all, you will learn by talking to the people right here and right now, and afterwards engaging with the apathetic and apologetic people out there, and together create a movement of active people that says there's something we can do. What are we waiting for? Welcome to ZA 2018.